Tanner Lecture on Human Values was endowed by Grace Adams Tanner and Obert Clark Tanner in 1978. For many years, Obert Tanner was a professor of philosophy at the University of Utah. Perhaps unusually for a philosophy professor, he was also an accomplished businessman, founding a company which produces a range of commemorative jewelry, including the medals for the 2002 Olympics in Salt Lake City. The Tanners were generous philanthropists. They supported the Utah Symphony Orchestra, built public fountains, and established philosophy libraries at a number of major universities, including a splendid philosophy library here at the University of Michigan. The Tanner lecturers were particularly close to the Tanners' hearts. Let me read from the document establishing these lectures. Quote, "Appointment as a Tanner lecturer is a recognition of uncommon achievement and outstanding scholarly capabilities in the field of human values. The lecturers may be drawn from philosophy, religion, the humanities, and the sciences, the creative arts and learned professions, or from leadership in public or private affairs. They are international and intercultural and transcend ethnic, national, religious, or ideological distinctions." In the same document, Professor Tanner writes, "I see the lecturers simply as a search for a better understanding of human behavior and human values. This understanding may be pursued for its own sake, but it may also eventually have practical consequences for the quality of personal and social life." The Tanner lectures are given annually at 9 institutions: Clare Hall, Cambridge, and Brasenose College, Oxford, both in Britain, and here in the US at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, Berkeley, Utah, and last but not least, Michigan. Now, to introduce this year's Tanner lecturer, I am pleased to present Derek Collins, Dean of the Humanities Division of the College of Literature, Science, and Arts at the University of Michigan.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. I'm very pleased to welcome John Broome, White's Professor of Moral Philosophy at Oxford University, to the University of Michigan to give our 28th Tanner Lecture on Values. Professor Broome is splendidly suited to this task. He's a distinguished professor of philosophy who has had an accomplished career as an economist. He's committed to showing how much economics and ethics have to do with each other, but also committed to pointing out when they're talking past each other and when each is trying to do the work of the other, sometimes without acknowledging that fact. He knows both fields extraordinarily well. He's at home in each, and so his criticisms of each are insider's criticisms, the most constructive sort. His work on his topic for today, climate change, exemplifies this virtue. He's right in the middle of policy discussions, trying to get economic analyses done better, not viewing them from the outside or denying that they should be done at all. Unlike most philosophers, he stands to make a significant practical contribution to a matter of real urgency. He's been amply prepared by training and experience to do so. Professor Broome was born in Kuala Lumpur and lived as a young child in Malaya and Singapore. He did his undergraduate work in mathematics and economics at Trinity Hall, Cambridge. He completed a PhD in economics at MIT in 1972. He then earned an MA in philosophy at Bedford College, London, the next year, by which time he'd already begun a 25-year career as a lecturer and professor of economics, first at Birkbeck College, London, and then at the University of Bristol. The disciplinary shift to philosophy came in 1996, accompanied by a geographical shift to the University of St. Andrews. There he held a professorship through 2000. John Broome has been White's Professor of Moral Philosophy at Oxford ever since then. There's been a fundamental question driving his research throughout, and it is simply this: what is the value of human life? The question has theoretical foundations. Its answer has practical implications. Professor Broome's work articulates both. At the theoretical foundations lie questions about the nature of value, questions about how to think about value, questions about how to act in light of value. Professor Broome's writings on rationality, normativity, and decision theory, a topic dear to the hearts of philosophers and economists alike, have had a formative influence on the recent investigation of these issues. The practical consequences of valuing human life are multifold. For instance, how we value human life should inform healthcare and climate change policies. These policies are liable to influence profoundly the number, quality, extent, and worldwide distribution of human lives over time. In works such as his books Weighing Goods, Equality, Uncertainty, and Time, and counting the cost of global warming, and Weighing Lives, Professor Broome has developed and defended principles for thinking comprehensively about different dimensions and different manifestations of the value of human beings. Professor Broome has helped to make the principled consideration of human value a basis for practical action as well. He served as a consultant for the World Health Organization, as well as for the Stern Review, commissioned by the British government. The Stern Review performed, roughly speaking, a cost-benefit analysis to determine whether significant efforts to mitigate climate change were worth it economically. The analysis required weighing the cost to present generations of mitigation measures, such as purchasing carbon offsets for air travel occasioned by Tanner lectures and symposia, which we've done, against the cost to future generations of refraining from such measures. Thus, the analysis requires a principle for assigning values to the well-being of future generations. Professor Broome elucidates the subtleties here beautifully in a 2008 Scientific American article that is probably required reading in environmental ethics curricula around the world. Resting its analysis on ethical considerations, particularly considerations of intergenerational equity, the Stern Review determined that present efforts to mitigate climate change did, in fact, make good economic sense. The review's findings and their basis are a subject of ongoing debate, but debate better focused, thanks to the report and to Professor Broome, on the fundamental question, how should we value human lives? So the discussion of climate change, its ethics, its economics, continues. Indeed, Professor Broome will continue it here this afternoon, at the Tanner Symposium tomorrow with Professors Nordhaus and Agrawal, and in his forthcoming book, Climate Matters, Ethics in a Warming World. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor John Broome.
Thank you. That was really kind of you. Thank you. I'm extremely grateful for that very, very generous introduction. Thank you. I'm humbled, really. I thought, have I really done all those things? Makes me feel some of them might have been worthwhile after all. And of course, I'm extremely honored to be invited to give a Tanner lecture. The Tanner lectures have made a tremendous contribution to thinking about values over the last couple of decades. I've been to several, I've read many more. Many of them are very well known and have spawned a lot of discussion within philosophy and elsewhere. And it's wonderful to have the opportunity of actually giving one myself. I really appreciate that. Well, we are all of us, as individuals, subject to various moral duties. We have a duty to be kind to strangers, to look after our parents when they get old, to keep our promises, and so on. We all know about those. And it's also true that governments have moral duties too. For instance, governments shouldn't imprison innocent people. They should protect refugees, and so on. And those are moral duties that fall on governments. They should also protect, look after the destitute, and engage in international relations to promote well-being of their own citizens and the rest of the world. Those duties of governments are what I call public morality, whatever they are, and I'm going to be talking about some of them later on. As a result of the existence of public morality, a sort of derivative morality falls on us as individuals, as citizens. We have civic duties, and our civic duties are to promote, to encourage our governments to act as they morally ought to. But those civic duties I'm not for this afternoon counting as part of private morality. So what I mean by private morality is the morality of our private lives when we're not engaged in political activity and trying to influence our governments. So that's the separation I'm making. the public morality, which is the morality of governments, the private morality, which is individual morality, apart from our civic duties. Climate change creates duties within both of those spheres, and I'm just going to mention some of them, some private ones and some public ones. Not going to try and give a complete catalogue, of course, but just mention a few. First, I need to classify the moral duties that we're under into two broad classes. On the one hand, there are duties of justice, and on the other hand, duties of goodness, or more technically, of beneficence. I don't insist that's an exclusive classification. There may be other sorts of moral duties too, but those are the two that I'm going to be concentrating on this afternoon. The duty of goodness is the duty simply to promote good in the world. And I'm going to assume that governments do bear that duty, at least to their own citizens, if not to everybody in the world. For example, they should manage their nation's economic system in a way that promotes the good of their people. They should align their banking regulations with that in mind, and so on. I do also think that individuals bear a duty of goodness, but that will turn out, as you see, not to be essential to the argument that I'm going to make this afternoon. So there are duties of goodness to promote good. But that's certainly not our only moral duty, promoting good. If there is something you could do that would promote the goodness of the world, it isn't necessarily so that you should do it. And in some cases, it's even prohibited that you should do it. There's a very well-known example, well-known amongst philosophers at any rate, of the surgeon who has 5 patients in her hospital, each needing a new organ. So there's a kidney patient who needs a kidney to survive, a heart patient who needs a new heart to survive, a liver patient who needs a liver to survive, and 5 of those. Now, the surgeon does something about this. She takes an innocent visitor to the hospital, kills her, extracts her 5 organs, distributes them to the 5 patients, thereby saving 5 lives at the expense of 1. That promotes good in the world. It adds to goodness. But obviously, she should not do that. It's an immoral act. And that shows that there is something in morality that prohibits, in some cases at least, promoting the greater good. And at least a part of that, whatever it is that sometimes prohibits the greater good, is a duty not to do harm. The duty not to do harm is not merely a duty to take account of the harm you do in the course of promoting good, to add it into your calculations when you're aiming at the good, because if that was so, then the surgeon would not be acting wrongly. She does take account of the fact that she kills 1 person, and that's a harm, but that's outweighed by the 5 savings of life that she does in exchange for that. So it's not merely that. It's a duty that goes further than that. It's a duty sometimes to refrain from harming, even when that would promote, your harming would promote greater good overall. So the duty of harm is a duty that acts against the duty to promote good in certain circumstances. But it's not an absolute duty. That's to say, there are circumstances where it's permissible for you to harm people. For example, it's permissible for you to harm somebody in self-defense, generally, or to harm somebody if that's a justified punishment that you're inflicting on her because she deserves it. So there is a duty not to harm, but it's not a duty that applies everywhere. On the other hand, it does stand against the duty to promote good in certain circumstances. Now, I'm sorry to say I can't delineate the boundaries of this duty not to harm. I can't tell you precisely which harms are permissible and which harms are not permissible, and that's a serious handicap, But I hope to show later that there is a sort of harming that is not permissible, and I hope to persuade you that it's not permissible by telling you enough about it just to make it clear that it isn't. Although I can't delineate the boundary sharply, I hope to persuade you that one particular sort of harm lies on a particular side of that boundary. I take this duty not to harm to be a duty of justice. Now, I don't think all that much turns on whether you call it a duty of justice or not, but it does have one of the characteristics of duties of justice which is essential to what I'm going to be saying. A duty of justice is a duty that's owed to a particular person or to particular people. So if you breach a duty of justice, then you're doing an injustice, and that injustice is always one that's done to some particular person. To express this fact that a duty of justice is owed, we often say that the person to whom it's owed has a right to your performing the duty. And I've just been saying in particular that people have a right not to be harmed, even often for the sake of the greater good overall. It's a duty of justice that they should not be, and that means that they have a right not to be harmed. Contrast that with the duty of goodness. Duties of goodness are not owed to people in particular. Perhaps I think we do have a duty of justice. We have a duty to promote good. For example, you might fulfill that duty by giving some money to charity, and you would be fulfilling your duty of good to do that. But most of us do not think that the people who receive the money have a right to that money. We don't think that people have a right to have money given to them in charity. And we do not think that we commit an injustice when we fail to give it to them. So the duty of goodness is not owed to people. So there's a distinction amongst different sorts of duty. And I'm now going to apply that distinction to the moral duties that arise from climate change. My first point is that the relative importance of those two sorts of duty is different between private morality and public morality. Justice is more important in private morality, goodness more important in public morality. Now, I realize that may come as a bit of a surprise to political philosophers who think of justice is primarily a political virtue, but I think they're wrong there. In fact, I'm going to argue that the private morality of climate change is governed entirely by the duty of justice, whereas the public morality is governed also by the duty of goodness. And I'm next going to explain why that is. It's for two main reasons. The first is a technical one, and my experience is that it goes down okay with philosophers, but it's very hard to get non-philosophers to take this very seriously. But I'm going to give it to you anyway, and then I'll come to the other one, which I hope everybody will be willing to take seriously. So first, the more technical reason why I make this difference between public and private morality. It's something known as the non-identity problem, which was made famous by a colleague of mine, Derek Parfit. Remember that the duty of justice is owed to particular people, and those people have a right to its performance. So let's ask whether people have a right to the public performance in respect of climate change. Take a particular person, call her Sarah. She lives in 150 years' time, and suppose her life is less good than it would have been had the world not be so full of pollution, had we not left so much greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. Could Sarah claim that we violated a right of hers in in acting profligately and dumping all the greenhouse gas that we have dumped? Could she say that she had a right to a better life and we denied her that right by emitting so much greenhouse gas as to make her life so bad? Well, I think she could not, and I'll explain why. Suppose we had instead taken the trouble to reduce our emissions. And by we, I'm referring to the present generation, either the present generation through the whole world or the present generation in a particular country. If we'd taken that trouble, we would have had to live our lives in a different way. The richer amongst us would have travelled less by car and plane. They'd have bought fewer consumer goods. All of these things are needed to reduce emissions. The poorer people would have lived differently. Their farming would have been easier. They would have found less need to move to the cities, less need to move to higher ground to get away from the floods. So everybody's life would have been different. Consequently, many people would have found different partners in their lives. For instance, the rich, traveling less, would have found partners in different places. They would have found different partners in their lives. They would have had babies with different children, different people, different partners. And even those who had the same partner would have had children at different times. Now, the identity of a person depends on the sperm and the egg that she comes from. A particular person could not have come from a different sperm and egg than the one that she did come from. Your identity is given by the sperm and egg. Consequently, even the slightest change in the circumstances of conception, the timing of conception or the circumstances of conception, let alone a variation in partners, makes a difference to who gets created. A slight change in people's lives then inevitably means that the children they have are different. You get different children if you live different lives. So if we had significantly altered our behavior to control the emission of greenhouse gas, the people who would have been created would have been quite different from the ones who actually are created. And within a couple of generations, the population of the world would have consisted of quite different people. This is something called the non-identity effect, which flows from doing something about greenhouse gas. So our Sarah, who I was talking about, would almost certainly not have existed at all had we reduced our emissions. And if she would not even have existed, she cannot plausibly claim that she had a right to a better life, which we violated by not reducing our emissions. We just could not have given her a better life. If we had tried, she wouldn't even have existed. So it's really not plausible that we owe it to her to reduce our emissions. We conclude that our emissions don't do any injustice to Sarah, and the same goes for nearly everybody in her generation. In a way, this non-identity effect gives us a sort of excuse as a generation as a whole from a charge of injustice. We are emitting all these greenhouse gases, but we are not doing an injustice to future generations as a result because of the non-identity effect. Now, that's an excuse from a charge of injustice, but please don't think it's an overall excuse from moral duties towards climate change. Our continued emissions are making the lives of whichever people do live in the future less good than the lives of people who live in the future could be. And that is a serious moral fault. It's a fault against the duty of justice, of goodness rather than against justice, but that doesn't mean that it's any less of a serious moral fault. It's not a violation of justice. The non-identity effect of a whole generation is obviously much bigger than the non-identity effect of a single person's emissions. If you or I alter our behavior so as to emit less, our lives will be different, and perhaps the lives of people near us. And so there will be a non-identity effect. The people that we create will be different from others, and this non-identity effect will gradually propagate itself through the population. But it's clearly much less. The non-identity effect of a single person is much less than the non-identity effect of a generation. And we as individuals do not have this excuse against a charge of injustice in what we do. If we emit greenhouse gas, we cannot say that we are not doing an injustice to future generations because of the non-identity effect. And that's the first reason why justice bears more heavily on us as a duty than it bears on nations and their governments. That's the first reason why I think that justice is more important for private morality than public morality. The second reason is that, so far as responding to climate change is concerned, the duty of goodness actually demands very, very little of an individual. It requires you to reduce your greenhouse gases, your gas emissions, only insofar as you can do that at very little cost to yourself. It almost certainly requires you to remember to switch off the light when you leave a room, things of that sort, things that involve very little effort. I claim that the duty of justice does not require more than that, and I'm going to explain why not, and this is a quantitative matter, so I'm going to have to say something quantitative about the amount of harm that we do by our emissions. To do this, I'm going to use a calculation that was shown me by a former colleague of mine in Oxford, Dave Frame. Frame did his best to calculate how much harm is done by a single individual through her emissions. I slightly edited his conclusion to make it, I hope, more plausible, actually. Let me emphasize, this is only meant to be a really rough calculation, just to give you some idea of the order of magnitude of the harm you do by your emissions. I think it's useful to have that sort of guide, but please don't think it's any more precise than that. So Frame calculates that the average citizen of a rich country, an OECD country, if she was born in 1950, will emit during her lifetime about 800 tons of carbon dioxide, or the equivalent of carbon dioxide. 800 tons warms the atmosphere in the way that greenhouse gases do, but by about 1/2 of 1/1000th of a degree. Not very much, as Frame pointed out. However, that doesn't mean that it isn't harmful. It may not be much warming, but it doesn't mean that it isn't harmful, because global warming does a lot of harm, and any contribution to it contributes to that harm. The World Health Organization has published predictions about the number of people who will be killed by climate change. So I'm going to, using their figures, I'm going to talk about how much killing you do by your emissions of carbon dioxide. We can calculate, on the basis of WHO figures, that the emissions of an average person from a rich country emitting 800 tons will shorten people's lives by some number of months, maybe half a year, something along those lines, some number of months. And your emissions during a single year will shorten lives in total by 1 or 2 days. Something like that. Of course, none of us is going to shorten any particular person's life by those amounts, but nevertheless, lives in total in the world will be shortened by something along those lines. That's a serious harm. I don't think any of us would want to be responsible for shortening lives by that much, by taking months off people's lives. And that tells you something which I think could be useful for those of you who despair in the face of climate change. A lot of people think climate change is such an enormous problem created by all the people in the world taken together that they as individuals can't do anything about it. That's not true. Your individual emissions are doing harm of about the amount that I've described. And consequently, if you stop those emissions, you will stop doing that harm by that amount. So you actually can do a significant amount of good simply by stopping your emissions. We aren't in a desperate situation where we as individuals can do nothing. Each of us can do some good. But that's not the point that I really want to make. The point I really want to make is that although that is a serious harm, it's not a very large harm. It's relatively small. Let's compare it with other things you might do and the good you could achieve by other things. Suppose you were to reduce your annual emissions to 0, and you were to do that in the cheapest possible way, which I shall describe in a moment. It's offsetting, actually. If you were to reduce them in the cheapest way, it would cost you over a year some few $100s, $200 or $300 maybe. And for that, you will extend lives by 1 or 2 days. But for $200 or $300, you can extend lives much more effectively in other ways. For instance, you can contribute to a charity that saves people from tuberculosis, and for that much money, they can save a person's life. They can extend a life by many years or decades. If you want to extend lives, that's a much, much better way of doing it. So there are better ways of using your resources to do good than to do it by reducing the amount of carbon dioxide you emit. Of course, if you reduce your emissions, it does good in other ways than simply saving people's lives, but the gap is very large, and there is no way that reducing emissions are going to do as much good as saving people from tuberculosis. If you wanted to improve the world, you should go on emitting as you're doing and use the money you save by not taking action against climate change, send that to a tuberculosis charity, and you will do much more good. Why doesn't that same argument apply to governments? I just said if you want to promote good, you shouldn't do it by reducing your emissions. Why doesn't that apply to governments? Only because governments have access to many more resources than individuals do. There are all the other things that need to be done and will do more good per unit of resource, such as saving people from tuberculosis, trying to eradicate malaria, providing clean water around the world, and so on. And all of those are things that governments ought to do. These are all good resources for governments to fulfill their duty of promoting good. But if they do all those things, it still turns out that they should be doing something about climate change. They should be reducing, using resources to reduce emissions of climate change. Because governments have control over much greater resources, they should deal with tuberculosis, eradicate malaria, provide clean drinking water, and all the other things, and they should reduce emissions of greenhouse gas. That doesn't apply to an individual. If you used all your resources for the other good things, then you wouldn't have any left over for doing something about climate change at the end of it. So that's the difference between individuals and governments. The duty of goodness does not require of individuals reducing their emissions. So the private morality of climate change, I think, does not arise from a duty of goodness. It arises instead from the duty of justice. So now I turn to what justice requires of individuals. Well, I've already said that each person's emissions of greenhouse gas do harm, and I've given you a rough estimate of it. And doing harm is often unjust. I earlier pointed out that there are some exceptions to the rule that you should not do harm to other people. But now I'm going to argue that your emissions of greenhouse gas are not exceptions under that rule. They are, in fact, harms that are prohibited by justice. Now, I'm sorry to say I can't do this definitively because, as I said, I don't know what the boundaries of the duty not to harm are. But I'm going to mention 7 features of emissions. And by the time I've gone through that list, I hope you'll be convinced that these really lie on the side of an injustice. I'll not mention sort of obvious points, like your emissions are not a merited punishment being inflicted on other people. They haven't given you permission to inflict it on them and so on. So, first point. The harm done by our emissions is the result of something that we do. A lot of people make a difference, moral difference, between doing something and merely allowing something to happen. And then make a difference between preventing harm and, causing harm and allowing harm to happen. Suppose you fail to donate to a charity that relieves poverty. Well, you fail to reduce the harm of poverty, but that's an omission on your part. It's not something that you positively do. And you may not think that that's an injustice. But on the other hand, the emissions of greenhouse gas are something that you do. We cause greenhouse gas to spew from our exhaust pipes and our chimneys. These are consequences of things that we do rather than things we omit to do. So that's one point. Second point is that the harm is not trivial. I've already given you an idea of the size of it. It may be permissible to inflict trivial harms on people, but this one is not trivial. That's the second point. Thirdly, it's not accidental. In fact, we do this harm knowingly. There are few people in the developed world who do not know about the greenhouse effect and the harm that they're doing to other people. If the harm was accidental, well, that might not be an offense against justice. In fact, it wouldn't be an offense against justice, but it's not. Fourth point, we don't compensate the victims of harm. You can sometimes cancel out an injustice by compensating the people on whom you inflict the harm. Here, the harm is being inflicted on people all over the world, and we do not compensate them for the harm that we're doing, so we don't cancel it out in that way. Fifth, most of us do these emissions for our own benefits. That's not true of all of us. There are some altruists I know who use whatever spare resources they've got to spread good around the world. And they might continue to emit and use the money they save by emitting to promote goodness among other people. I'm not addressing those. If you're one of those, I'm not addressing you. I'm addressing the main unaltruistic majority of us. And we get benefit ourselves from our emissions. So we emit in order to benefit ourselves. I did earlier say that justice prevents you from doing harm even for promoting the greater good altogether. And it much more strongly prohibits you from doing harm in order to promote your own good. So that's another case that shows that it's a duty of justice, an offense against justice to do this harm. Sixth point, these harms are not reciprocated. Some harms that we do are reciprocated. For instance, the harm done when you drive on a congested road is a reciprocal one. You hold up other people, they hold up you, and we don't think that those are an injustice because they're reciprocated. But the harm of emissions is not reciprocated. It's generally the rich of the world doing harm to poorer people in the world, and they do not reciprocate to anything like the same degree. So I'm addressing my case to the richer ones, the ones who are doing unreciprocated harms. Seventh characteristic, we could actually easily reduce these harms, as I'll explain in a moment. It might be permissible to do a harm that you can't help, but this is one actually that we can help. And I'm about to say how. So those are 7 features, and I hope that once you've seen all of those, you will be persuaded that this is a harm that infringes against our duty of justice. Emitting carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases in general is an injustice. It's an injustice of harming other people. And it follows that each of us is under a duty of justice not to do it. Justice requires all of us to emit no greenhouse gas which does harm, or at least not to do that without compensating the people who are harmed by it. Your carbon footprint ought to be 0 unless you make restitution. That's strong advice and sort of embarrassing for a moral philosopher. Moral philosophers deal in generalities. We talk in a rather high level about the structure of morality and things like that. We don't generally find ourselves preaching particular moral principles to people, but here am I doing exactly that, not something I expected to be doing. But fortunately, you'll see in a moment that although this is strong advice, it can be, you can comply with it relatively easily. So that's what I'm going to go on to. So let's ask, I've told you what I think your duty of justice is. By what means should you satisfy this requirement of justice? Well, you might try and do it by compensating the people you harm. That certainly would be a way. And if you did it, it wouldn't cost you very much, oddly enough. And that's because most of the harm you do will happen far in the future. Your carbon dioxide will stay in the atmosphere for a very long time, and during all that time it will go on harming people. So a lot of the harm is far in the future, and that means if you want to compensate people for the harm, you've got plenty of time to build up your resources, your financial resources, in order to do it. You can use the power of compound interest by saving money in the bank and using it to compensate people later on when they require it. And in fact, William Nordhaus has done a calculation that says, I hope I've got this figure right, that if you're lucky enough to be able to save your money at an interest rate of 5.5%, not such an easy thing to do these days, 5.5% a year, $7.40 will be enough to compensate people for all the harm that that's done by 1 ton of emissions. Since you'll probably emit 20 or 30 tons during a year, that's a cost of a few $100s. Should be enough to compensate people. So that's one way you might try doing it. However, I don't recommend that means of satisfying your duty, because it's going to fail. Remember that the duty of justice is owed to particular people, all the people that you harm in particular. And your greenhouse gas does harm to virtually everybody in the world, and it's going to do it over a very long period of time. And you're not, in practice, going to be able to compensate everybody for the harm that you do. Furthermore, you don't know how much compensation is really needed. I've given you William Nordhaus's figure, but I don't know that he would think that that was absolutely precise. In fact, the uncertainty about the harm done by greenhouse gas is very large indeed. So you really have no idea of how much you would need to save up in order to compensate people in the future. So I don't recommend that means. You'd do much better not to make the emissions in the first place, and then no compensation will be required. And, surprisingly, this is possible. It's true, you couldn't do it by living in a way that didn't cause any emissions, because everything you do causes emissions. You know, every time you buy a consumer good, gas has been emitted as a result of producing that good. That's true of virtually everything that you buy. You can reduce emissions to some extent yourself, and we know how to do it. You can be frugal with you can generally be frugal, be particularly frugal with energy, eat less meat and so on. We all know the sorts of things that will reduce emissions, and many of those you can do at little cost to yourself, but you won't be able to reduce your emissions to zero by those means. And really, I think the only effective way of reducing them to zero is to cancel them out or offset your emissions. Offsetting, I think, is a way to fulfill your duty of justice, and I'm going to explain in a moment how it works. Please remember, I'm not telling you that offsetting your emissions is a way to solve the problem of climate change. The problem of climate change is that climate change does a great deal of harm, and this is not a way to do good, to cancel out the great deal to stop it doing that great deal of harm. I've already told you that it's not a good way of doing good in the world. What I'm recommending you to do, which is offsetting, is not a good way of promoting good in the world. That's not why I'm telling you to do it. It's not an effective way of making the world a better place, and it will not solve the problem of climate change. It doesn't derive from your duty of goodness. It's simply that you should not do emissions of greenhouse gas because you should not harm people under the circumstances that I've outlined. That's the duty of justice, nothing to do with the duty of goodness. We should not do it. And offsetting our emissions is a way in which we can do that. How does that work? Well, for every unit of greenhouse gas that you cause to be added to the atmosphere, you take a unit away from the atmosphere. That's the basic idea of offsetting. You add gas, you subtract gas at the same time. If you offset in that way, then you, on balance, add nothing, add no greenhouse gas. Of course, offsetting doesn't remove the very molecules that you emit, but the atmosphere doesn't care which molecules are warming it. If you offset all your emissions, you make sure that your presence in the world doesn't add to the amount of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. So you do not contribute to the warming of the atmosphere. So by the means of greenhouse gas, you do not in fact do any harm. You don't warm the atmosphere at all, and you therefore do no harm. It's not that you do harm which you somehow compensate for. You do not do harm in the first place if you do your offsetting. How do you do that in practice? How do you take molecules of greenhouse gas out of the atmosphere as you emit them? Well, you could do it. There is a do-it-yourself way of doing it, which is to plant trees. Trees are good subtractors of carbon dioxide. They take the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, use the carbon to build their bodies, and release the oxygen, which is not a greenhouse gas. So if you can get your tree to grow at the same rate as you are emitting gas, then you will be successfully offsetting. But there's a problem with that, and that is not only have you got to get the carbon out of the atmosphere, you've got to get it out and keep it out forever if you're going to do your offsetting properly. And with trees, unless you take special steps, that's not going to happen, because after a while, probably after you're dead, the trees will die, they'll fall over, and they will decay away, and the carbon will go back into the atmosphere. So actually that means it's not very easy to achieve. It doesn't work very easily unless you somehow or other can tie up your heirs in order to replant your forest every time it decays. So I don't recommend that method of doing it either. There's a more easy means of offsetting, which is not do-it-yourself. It's what I call preventive offsetting. Instead of taking carbon dioxide molecules out of the atmosphere, you prevent carbon dioxide molecules from getting into the atmosphere in the first place, and that has just the same effect. And there are plenty of commercial organizations that will offer to prevent carbon emissions on your behalf. You pay them a fee per ton of prevention, and they do it. They've got various means by which they do it. They have projects which are intended to prevent emissions. Often they build renewable energy sources, particularly in developing countries. They build hydroelectric power plants, solar power plants, and so on. And that means that electricity in those countries, less of it will be produced by fossil fuel, so there will be less emissions that result from that. Other projects promote the efficient use of energy and reduce emissions that way. One that I particularly like installs efficient wood-burning stoves in people's houses in Africa and Asia. It turns out that a lot of carbon dioxide emissions are caused by people cooking on wood. And if they cook instead on efficient stoves, that saves a huge amount of burning of wood and is a very effective way of reducing carbon emissions. So that's the sort of thing that happens with preventive offsetting. It too is actually remarkably cheap. Responsible companies, and by that I mean companies that I believe actually are doing this prevention, will offer to offset a ton of emissions for something in the region of $10. So again, you can offset all your emissions for a few $100s in a year. And that's why I said that you can relatively easily avoid harming other people, which was a part of my case for saying that this is something you should do. Many environmentalists are strongly opposed to offsetting, as you no doubt know. Greenpeace is an example. I have here a quote from Greenpeace. Greenpeace says, "The truth is, once you put a ton of CO2 into the atmosphere, there's nothing offsetting can do to stop it changing our climate." Well, I puzzled over that, wondering whether that claim is true or not. I think it's actually not true. If at the same time as you put a ton of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, you take out a ton of carbon dioxide, your actions as a whole do not add to the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So since the climate does not change, it does not seem to me that your carbon that you emit is changing the climate. How can it change the climate if the climate does not change? So I think your ton of emissions, when it's offset, does not change the climate. And at any rate, I'm sure that you do not change the climate. And that's the important thing. Still, I recognize that Greenpeace and other environmentalists do have a case to make against offsetting. But I've decided not to review that because I want to get onto public morality now, and I hope that that's something we can talk about later this afternoon or in the symposium tomorrow if you want to pursue it. So now there's going to be an abrupt change of topic. I'm switching from private duty to public duties. Government's duties of morality. Well, governments, like individuals, bear duties of justice, I think. I've said that they're lessened by the non-identity effect, but still, there are people, living people, who are affected by the emissions from nations that governments control. So there are duties of justice that fall on governments, but I'm not going to concentrate on them because I've been talking about justice up to now, and I now want to talk about the duty of goodness by way of contrast. I said that fulfilling your duty of justice would not solve the problem of climate change, but what I want to do now is to get onto something that I think just possibly may contribute to solving the problem of climate change. So this is at the point where I start talking about goodness, improving things in the world, rather than fulfilling duty of justice. I'm going to make a point that I've come to think is actually extremely important in the politics of climate change. And I would like to be better known because just possibly it might be beneficial. When governments try to promote goodness, as most governments do, they fulfill that duty of goodness that they have, at least to some extent. That's not such an easy thing to do, and it's going to involve some complex calculation. The actions of governments, particularly over climate change, involve a lot of costs and a lot of benefits. They do good in some way, but they also involve harms in other ways. And that means that in order to decide what's the right thing to do, you have to do a lot of balancing. You have to put together the different sorts of good that you might do and the different sorts of costs that are involved in doing them, and you have to balance the good you might do against the cost of doing it. That's to say, in a broad sense, you have to do cost-benefit analysis if you're a government and you want to promote your duty of good. And that's likely to call for quantitative methods of economics. It also is going to call for a lot of work within ethics, because the weighing of benefits and costs involves setting values on these benefits and costs, and at heart those values are things that come from ethics. There are many ethical questions involved. How should benefits to the rich be weighed against benefits to the poor? How should we value the loss of a person's life against the more mundane harms that can come to people? How should we take account of the huge uncertainty that surrounds climate change in our decision making? How should we weigh distant future benefits against nearby present costs? How should we take account of changes in the world's population, which will be the consequence of climate change and the consequence of doing something about it? How even should we take account of the possibility of extinction, which is certainly something that might be caused, our extinction, that might be caused by climate change if it's worse than we expect it to be? All of those are fertile sources of debate, but I'm not going to engage in those debates. I could have spent many lectures stirring up controversy over those things. Instead, I'm going to say something that I think should be less controversial, and I think actually may be something that has some effect on doing something about climate change. So I'm going to say something about goodness that does not involve the weighing or aggregating of different costs and benefits. And oddly enough, it's really a very, very simple point of economics. When somebody engages in some activity that causes the emission of greenhouse gas, the gas that gets emitted is spread around the world. It gets everywhere. And it delivers small harms all over the world. So the harms of things that people here and now do are spread everywhere across the world and across time very extensively, and they fall on people everywhere and at many subsequent times. Now those harms caused as a result of your emissions are among the costs of what you do. You do something, it causes emissions. Some of those emissions cause harms, they are a cost. So a lot of the cost of what you do is actually not borne by you, it's borne by the people around the world who suffer those harms. In economists' terminology, greenhouse gas emissions are an externality. They impose external costs on people. A vital point, extremely widely recognized in the economics of greenhouse gas. How could it not be? What's wrong with externalities? Well, in economic theory, perhaps the main thing that's recognized as being wrong with them is that they cause inefficiency. I'm going to use this word inefficiency in a very precise sense. It's what's often called Paretian inefficiency. In that precise sense, when I say that something is inefficient, a state is inefficient, I mean that if you were in that state, it would be technically possible for things to be different in such a way that somebody would be better off than they are in that state and nobody would be worse off. So an inefficient state is one where you could make somebody better off without making anybody worse off. That's the notion of inefficiency that I'm relying on, the Paretian notion for those of you who are used to that term. And externalities cause inefficiency in that sense. That's the elementary point of economics that I mentioned. That means that greenhouse gases create inefficiency, which means that the result of having greenhouse gases being emitted is that somebody could be made better off without anybody being made worse off. It's technically possible. That has to be true just as a result of economic theory. I have to admit that my teacher of economics, Duncan Foley, was the person who pointed this out to me after a great many years. Although this is an elementary and pretty obvious point that I just made, I didn't notice it until he mentioned it to me. It's true that the elementary economics would need to be modified a bit to take account of the non-identity effect, but nevertheless, it's going to remain true that because for greenhouse gases, we find ourselves in a situation where it would be technically possible to make people better off without making anybody worse off. To put it another way, to eliminate this problem of greenhouse gas, to get to a position where the greenhouse gas is no longer creating an externality, to get that position, we could get there without anybody's making a sacrifice. We could get there in a way that doesn't do any harm to anybody. No sacrifices are necessary in order to eliminate this problem of externality caused by greenhouse gas. And I can describe in sort of very general terms how that's going to be done, or could be done. Although we're bequeathing to our successors a dirty atmosphere, we're also doing quite a lot of good for our successors in other ways. We're leaving them a lot of stuff. We're leaving them a lot of resources. We're leaving them cities, for instance. We're leaving them economic infrastructure of other sorts. We're leaving them cultivated land. We're leaving them those natural resources that we don't use up ourselves. All of those things we're passing down to our successor generations. And we can exploit that point. So this is what we can do. Suppose we reduce our emissions of greenhouse gas. Now that, other things being equal, has a cost. We will have to travel less and things of that sort. So we will have to bear a cost, make a sacrifice in order to reduce our emissions. But we could compensate ourselves for that sacrifice by consuming more of the other resources that we were going to leave to the future generations. So we leave less to future generations. And in fact, we could compensate ourselves to an extent that we ourselves do not suffer. We reduce our emissions, but we get more fun in other ways. So in fact, we are no worse off as a result. Future generations would receive less of those other goods, but on the other hand, they would inherit a cleaner atmosphere, and they would be better off too. So everybody would end up better off. That's how we could do this thing of dealing with the externality without anybody's bearing any sacrifice. Here's a slightly more concrete example of how we might do it. We could impose a carbon tax. And if you set the correct carbon tax, that will eliminate the inefficiency. If there's a carbon tax which is set at the right level to take account of the external costs, and people react to that, then they will be, the inefficiency will be cancelled out. It will be internalized, as economists say, and we will end up at a position which is Pareto efficient. So we set a carbon tax, but we compensate people for paying the carbon tax by giving them a lump sum payment each year equal to the amount of carbon tax that they pay, or at any rate enough to compensate them for having to pay it. So we tax, we compensate, none of us ends up worse off because we're all compensated. How do we pay the compensation? Well, some of it can be paid out of the tax itself, but that won't be enough to cover all of it. The rest of it will have to be paid using a loan, by debt. It'll have to be paid by debt, which will later have to be repaid by future generations. So in effect, we're getting the future generations to pay for our compensation, and that's exactly what we want to do. We're giving them a less dirty atmosphere. They're having to pay us something for it. What they pay us for it still leaves them better off, and it makes sure that we are no worse off. So we could do that. That's technically possible. But that raises a puzzle. Delegates turn up each year to meetings of the United Nations Framework on Climate Change, and each year what they talk about is how to share amongst the nations the sacrifice that's required for dealing with the problem of climate change. They're trying to divide up the burdens of solving the problem amongst themselves. And of course, no government is going to agree to take a sacrifice, and the result is that nothing significant ever gets done at these meetings, and anything near what needs to be done is done, because no nation will make a sacrifice. But now here am I saying no sacrifice is necessary. How on earth can it be that the delegates are asked to make a sacrifice when no sacrifice is necessary, and the result is that we get no progress on climate change? How can that be? Well, I think the answer to that is the way that the economics of the subject has gone. It certainly would be possible, in principle, to eliminate this externality without anybody making any sacrifice. And doing so would definitely be an improvement on the present situation, since more people would be better off and nobody would be worse off. That's unequivocally an improvement. But it doesn't follow that that's the best thing to do about climate change. It's a thing that could be done, and it would make somebody better off without making anyone worse off, but it may not be the best thing. And the economists who work on this subject have been interested in finding what is the best thing. They're trying to help governments promote their duty of goodness by achieving the best thing. That's to say, they are doing optimizing. They're trying to work out how the climate economics can be managed so as to achieve the best result. And I think that the effect of this, because they're looking for the best, is that they are actually making the best the enemy of the good. It turns out, if their calculations are correct, that the best thing to do about climate change is for we, the present generation, actually to make sacrifices. I've told you we don't have to in order to solve the externality, but the best world is one where we do make sacrifices. That's a conclusion of the Stern Review, and I think it's a conclusion of that William Nordhaus comes to in his book too, though the magnitudes are very different in the two studies. To see what's going on, think of these three alternative possibilities. On the one hand, business as usual, not do anything much about climate change. On the other hand, do what I just described, which I'll call the compensation plan. Reduce our emissions, but compensate ourselves for doing that so that we end up no better off and future generations' life is improved. Let's call that the compensation plan. And then finally, there is the optimal plan, which is the one that the cost-benefit analysis tells us is really the best thing to do. And we can learn from that analysis that the optimal plan is better than the compensation plan, and the compensation plan is in turn better than business as usual. Now, the compensation plan is clearly unattractive. It's an arrangement whereby the people who are doing pollution at the moment are persuaded to stop doing their pollution and fully compensated for doing that. And that's to incorporate in the final outcome the injustice, whatever injustice we're already doing. So at the moment, we rich countries are emitting gases which are doing harm to small island nations in the Pacific and so on, and they are suffering harm, and the outcome of the compensation plan would be that those small island nations no longer get greenhouse gas dumped on them, but they pay for that by compensating the emitters to a degree that persuades the emitters to do it. Now, that's better for both of them, but it's not just. If somebody is hurting you every day, you can maybe improve your situation by paying her to stop hurting you, and that would be better for you, and of course it'll be better for her too. So it is better for the both of you, but it clearly is merely perpetuating the injustice with which you started. But that's in effect what this compensation plan is doing. So it's unattractive. And I understand, therefore, why the political process aimed not at that plan, but at the optimal plan. But I've turned cynical as a result of seeing what happens at the UNFCCC meetings. The optimal plan, as things stand, is unattainable. Governments will not make the sacrifices that the optimal plan calls for on behalf of their constituents. So I think instead we should aim for the compensation plan. And that means that the questions that would be discussed at the UNFCCC would not be how to distribute the burden of dealing with climate change, but how to distribute the benefit of dealing with climate change. There is a benefit of dealing with it because it's an externality, and the only question is who would get that benefit. That, I think, would break the logjam at the UNFCCC. That's, I think, what we should aim for now. As I say, that is sort of cynical, but it is a way of focusing the problem directly at, focusing the political effort directly at the problem of climate change. The question of the difference between the compensation plan and the optimal plan, that is a difference of distribution between generations. In the optimal plan, the present generation makes a sacrifice for the sake of future generations. So it means that resources are being transferred from the present to the future. There is more resource going to the future, less resource going to the present. That's the difference between the compensation plan and the optimal plan, and that's a difference of distribution between the generations. It's not entirely a problem of climate change. The question of distribution between generations is much bigger than the question of the problems that are caused by climate change itself to that distribution. There is more to distribution than simply climate change. And if we aim for the best, what we're doing is saddling the politics of dealing with climate change with not only dealing with climate change, but also with correcting the distribution of resources between the generations. It's adding extra burden to the politics, and I don't think it's going to succeed. I think we should deal with the pure climate change problem first, go for compensation, and then I hope that will break the logjam, and actually the outcome could be that we get nearer to the optimal position after all. Once the politics gets moving again, we might actually move towards creating something nearer to the best possible world. We will have broken the negative approach that people are taking to it at the moment. So I haven't abandoned the aim of doing the best, but I think it would be a good start to aim for compensation. And that proposal sets a task for economists. The theory tells us that the compensation plan is possible. Nobody need make a sacrifice. But to make it possible in practice is going to require some work. We've got to reduce our carbon emissions, and that's going to cost us something, but the cost of doing it is going to have to be financed, in effect, by loans from future generations. We're going to have to bear loans, take out loans in order to pay for it. We're going to have to increase the debt of the nations that are doing it, but everybody knows that there's a limit to the amount that governments can borrow and get away with it, given the market conditions in the world as it is. So the job that I recommend to economists is to figure out a way of getting around that limit. I think economists need to find ways of creating financial institutions of sufficient strength that they allow the present generation to take out debt against future generations that really means something, the debt that will actually stick. If they do that, they will make the compensation plan possible. They may break the logjam. They may be able to restart progress on climate change. I hope that the final outcome will be more like the optimal plan. But even if it isn't, at least the economists, if they do that, will have contributed to dealing with the problem of climate change. Thank you.
Well, I had every expectation that a philosopher would approach an environmental problem in the broadest possible terms. And alas, global warming is an environmental issue, and it's dealt with almost exclusively in terms of economics. Is there a morality to forcing animals to migrate, to bleaching of corals because oceans warm? Isn't there a morality involved that goes beyond considerations of human welfare and human economics?
Yes, the answer is there is. And I'm sorry, I didn't try and deal with all of the morality of climate change this afternoon. I dealt with an exclusively human department of it. So forgive me for that, but in an hour, what can you do? No, I mean, I just want to say I agree with you. I mean, there is clearly a moral issue. I don't know what the answer is going to be, but there is a moral question. There is a question within moral philosophy of whether we owe a duty to nature. I don't think there's any question that we owe a duty to animals not to harm them, but whether we owe a duty to nature to preserve it. That's a real question within moral philosophy. I didn't talk about it. Forgive me for not talking about it, and actually I don't know what the answer to that one is.
I have a very practical question. I wonder if you could explain a little more detail exactly how we would shift this debt to future generations. The government simply print money and rely on inflation to inflict the loan on future generations, or how practically would it be done?
Yes, well, I have an excuse because I'm not an economist, right? I was an economist, but not anymore. And I said this is a problem for economists to create the institutions. But, you know, I have the idea that there needs to be some sort of an international bank set up by international agreement, the International Bank of Climate Change, shall we say, and the International Bank issues certificates which are backed by long-term bonds, you know, bonds, 50, 100-year bonds. Those are the bonds that finance the spending on reducing climate change. So they're the ones that are used to pay the compensation to people who does it. Now, those bonds have to hold their value. Now, there isn't actually anything wrong with 50, 100-year bonds that hold their value. There are, in the world, long-term bonds around. The problem is the quantity of debt rather than the length of debt. And many countries seem to be up against it. They've got to the point where they can't borrow anymore. There are plenty of European countries. We know this in Europe better than anywhere else. Why can't they borrow more? Well, the markets get nervous and won't lend them anymore. So they don't have sufficient security. Although they are sovereign and they have sovereign tax-raising power, that is not enough to convince the market sufficiently to lend them any more money. Well, that's what I think economists should find a way of getting around. The governments we've got at the moment are not able to maintain their credit rating sufficiently to borrow more money. We've got to find a way of allowing the international community to borrow more money. That will then be repaid by the future generations. It's a cowardly thing to do. I have no idea how to do this, but that's not my job.
I recall a presentation given last year, I think sometime on tour, by a Canadian economist, Jeff Broome, and he was explaining the issue of the emergence of the third world and their own carbon emissions. Like, for example, the demand for oil is highest in OPEC, for example, because they need oil for their own domestic production, for like fresh water. And for countries like OPEC, where they were at first on tribal level, offsetting probably isn't that very easy, both because of like there's no where to plant trees in like the Middle East, for instance, so not as much space as we can, or also because the cost of energy there, just like oil is really cheap for energy production, and so it might take a while for energy supply to shift towards renewables. Where do you see, like as we as the developed world start to put a cap on our, or however we start to handle our emissions? Where do you see the problem of climate change going as the third world probably does not do that because it would create a large burden on their own economies and people?
Right. So at first I thought you were raising a problem about what I said about justice, but actually you're really thinking about solving the problem of climate change, right? Given that there is going to be enormously increasing demand for energy among the poorer countries. Is that it? Yeah. Well, I haven't really anything to add to what other people say. There just has to be dramatically less emissions in the rich countries, since the poor countries are going to emit more. We in the rich countries are going to have to reduce our emissions by 80–90% within the next few decades in order to allow room for the poor countries to do it. The only thing that I've added is that it is possible for us to compensate ourselves for doing that. As I say, the result will not be pretty, but at least it's something that might happen. Whereas I don't believe that governments are going to do this. It may be that most of the individual members of of a society would be willing to make sacrifices for the sake of the future. That may well be, but their governments aren't willing to make sacrifices on their behalf. And you see that. They go to the UNFCCC and they will go away empty-handed. So we've got to reduce our emissions by the same. I'm not saying it's any less than everybody recognizes. To a very, very large degree, we've got to. Is this some? I'll shout. Well, actually, people wanting to record the. Oh no, the recording is still working. Is that right? This is okay. So, can you hear me at the back? Good. We've got to reduce our emissions. We know how much we've got to reduce our emissions. I haven't changed that at all. We've got to do that if we're to solve the problem of climate change.
My question is about how do you propose the economic source of solutions could address the complete change in landscape that is going to occur? Loss of glaciers, drinking water, changing coastlines, flooding and inundation in other areas, and in some cases the destruction of countries. How can that be taken into account in the solutions?
This one work? Oh, I'll put it here. Thank you. Well, it's very scary. I don't want to diminish the problems. We're already committed to very great changes in the geography of the Earth. That's certainly true. Are you saying that I need to tell you in detail what are the adaptation measures that we'll need to take? Because I'm not really able to do that in detail.
I mean, the point that I was trying to get to was it seems like a lot of the economics doesn't really deal with the whole concept of loss of entire areas of land, loss that would oversee any sort of economic structure that you would put in place.
Yeah, so as you view the prospect, things look really bad. We're going to have meters of sea level rise, we're going to have Bangladesh uninhabitable, and so on. So let's suppose that that is what's going to happen. I don't know. I mean, as you know, there's a lot of uncertainty, and some people think that maybe these really bad results won't happen. Maybe if we keep warming within 2 degrees, really bad things won't happen. But let's suppose that they do happen. Now, I didn't say that if we go for the solution I was aiming for, which I call the compensation plan, it would stop those bad things from happening. So bad things are going to happen. It just means that things would be a bit less bad for everybody than they would be if we didn't do anything about it. So if we now act to reduce climate change, well, maybe it's too late for Bangladesh, but maybe we'll save the Nile Delta. Maybe the water supply from the Himalayas will not dry up because we managed to act on it quick enough. Maybe we could even save Greenland from melting and save that 7-meter rise that would happen as a result of it. Maybe there are things we can do that would make it less bad. Well, sure, there are things we can do that would make it less bad. How bad it will actually be, I haven't tried to predict, and that was no part of my argument. I didn't need to. My argument was, however bad it's going to be, there is a way of making it better for some people without making it worse for anybody, and that way will remove the externality of climate change. Things may already be so bad that life is going to be dreadful in the future, but it'll be less bad.
Thank you.
Hi, I was curious about your claim that if I offset my emissions, then I won't have harmed future generations. And in particular, I'm just imagining a case where, you know, my husband and I go for a walk around Oxford, and I'm smoking a cigarette, and we happen to walk by your rooms in Corpus, and it just ends up being most convenient for me to put the cigarette butt into your office. And
I think you better not do that.
And then the very next day, we take the same walk, only this time he's smoking, and he starts to flick the cigarette, and I say, oh no, just give it to me, and I'll throw it out. And I think the intuitive thing to say about this example is that I have, in this case, harmed you. I have thrown the cigarette in your office, and thereby harmed you. I have also, in this case, helped you. I have prevented a cigarette being thrown at your office, and thereby helped you. And I'm wondering why you don't think the analogous thing about my relationship to 2162 Sarah, namely, I throw some carbon molecules into her atmosphere and thereby hurt her, and I also, by offsetting emissions, prevent some carbon molecules from being thrown into her atmosphere and thereby helped her. Sorry, I've thereby harmed and thereby helped.
Okay. Well, I agree that it's not, I hesitate about what I say. But it does depend on the nature of the carbon molecules, that they're not so like cigarettes. So carbon molecules go all around the world, they mix in the atmosphere, they're all thoroughly mixed and they stay there for centuries. So the harm they do is very, very widely spread. So that's a difference from the cigarette butt. It's this very cigarette butt which is causing me agony in that I find it on my carpet. As I said, the atmosphere really doesn't care which of the molecules that are warming it, and the harm is done via the yes, this is what I should say. The harm is done via the warming, and so far as I can tell, I do not cause any warming if I cancel my molecules. So I don't cause warming, so I can't cause the harm can't be causing the harm that's caused by warming. Now, yeah, well, perhaps I can say it for you. So what you're going to say is, well, the harm to me is that is caused by the cigarette butt lying on my carpet. Well, what's the next stage? Okay, you said.
So I feel like there's this question about what the nature of causal relata are, and if I'm a sort of rah-rah object causation person, then it would be interesting if that committed me to certain ethical claims, whereas if I were sort of a more fact causation person, it wouldn't commit me to particular claims,
Yeah.
Ethical claims. So I just, for what it's worth, maybe that actually is, maybe the metaphysics has some sort of implications for ethics, but I think that's
Well, it wouldn't be a bad thing if it did, would it? I mean,
yeah.
be quite nice if metaphysics made a difference to the ethics. But yeah, sure. I mean, this isn't perfectly straightforward by any means, but that's my case. What I do does not warm the atmosphere, therefore it does not harm. I was cautious about Greenpeace, who say that my ton of emissions causes harm, even though I subtract another ton of emissions. They've got a case, I think. So the metaphysics certainly is something Greenpeace should be looking into. But I think I do not cause harm.
Let me change the subject to the future a little bit. I'm having trouble with the notion of how one creates a sense of moral obligation in future generations, to use her year 2162, to pay off debt incurred to do me no harm in 2162. And I have no way of easily observing the harm that would have been had that debt not been accrued. So how does one create a sense of obligation to pay off some good deed of the past?
Okay, I was going to give a quick answer to that, but then I thought of the case of Greece, and I realized it isn't so quick. The quick answer was they don't have any choice. They're in debt, and they've got to pay the debt. The difficulty is illustrated by Greece, which is in debt, and we say it's got to pay the debt. The people of Greece think, no, they don't want to pay the debt. So what happens then? Well, I think certainly this institution that I'm saying we need to create is going to have to be strong enough to ensure that debts get paid. I mean, and it'll have to be as strong as that if it's going to be able to issue debt in the first place, so that the people will have to be willing to think that the debts are going to get paid. And long-dated debts do get paid at the moment. You can buy 100-year debentures in London, I believe. You're not going to repay them. It's going to have to be your heirs that repay them, but that doesn't stop them being worth money. People are willing to accept that your heirs will repay them. So I think my quick answer is my main answer, but I'm not quite sure how to deal with the problem of resistance like the Greek resistance. I mean, what the Greek government thinks is it's got to pay back the debt, and it will do whatever is necessary to control its population so that it will. It thinks it can do it. I'd see there's a problem. Yeah.
He has to go to the basement.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
There's a tornado warning, and we're asked to go to the basement. I'm sorry about that. I'm sure we can have a lot of fun in the basement.